Okay, I'm going to talk a little bit about my family history, my work history, my activities with the Unitarian Church, and if there's time, maybe a few other things that could be of interest. So I was born in 1936. My father was a social worker, my mother was a school teacher, and I had two younger sisters. I was born in Niagara Falls, and even in my early days, I pretty much showed up that I was an introvert. My first and second grade, we moved to Watertown, New York. My father ran the children's home there. The children's home was sort of on the edge of the town. We lived in an old farmhouse, and the children's home was right next door to where we were. And I would walk to school with the children from the home, and really didn't have any other people to deal with. When I was going into third grade, my father took a job in Cincinnati, Ohio. An old friend of his ran the children's home in Cincinnati. He worked in the downtown office as a social worker. I never really knew what he did. He didn't really talk very much. I think maybe he was an introvert also. But I did know that one of the things he did was he had to sign off on all adoptions. But we lived right next door to the children's home. There weren't many other children my age in the neighborhood. So actually, if I had free time, I would spend time over at the children's home. And in the summers, they had a lot of activities. We had archery, we had different kinds of games, and I pretty much acted like one of the children that were there. Now, this was during the Second World War. My father, who I think was sort of a frustrated farmer, he had victory gardens any place there was an empty plot of land. My parents were divorced between the 8th and 9th grade, and my mother had friends in Watertown who told her she should come back to Watertown. She had a teacher's license for New York State. She couldn't teach in Cincinnati. So my mother and my two sisters and I moved back to Watertown, and I went to school, high school in Watertown. I lived close to the school so I could walk to school, and I worked in gas stations in the summer. And as with most introverts, I only had one really good friend. I built a lot of radio things myself. I built flying model airplanes, which we'd take to contacts. For example, here's one of my last big airplanes that I made. My mother was very active in the little theater productions. There was no television in Watertown at that time. The nearest television station was in Syracuse, but there's a big hill between Syracuse and Watertown. And unless you had a 40 or 50-foot tower on top of your house, you didn't get any TV. So my mother was active in these little theater productions. She was a good actor, and I would build sets for the productions, and I'd work backstage during the shows. So my mother insisted that I take high school courses that would ready me for college. I kept telling her I thought I should really be taking auto mechanics because I didn't think we'd have enough money for me to go to college. Another example of being an introvert, when I had in high school to give a verbal book report, I'd sit in the back of the class and keep my head down and hope the teacher would forget that I existed. Of course, she never forgot. But I did actually get to go to college. I went to Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute as an electrical engineer. It was a difficult time, but I made it through. I did get a loan from the school for part of the time that I was there. And when I was going to school, I learned how to design things with vacuum tubes. Transistors were invented while I was in college. But they didn't teach it in college because nobody knew anything about transistors yet. I married my first wife, Fran, the summer after I graduated from college. My first job, things were a little bit tight, but I did get a job as an instructor at a 2-year school in Canton, New York, which is even further north than Watertown. And this was a 2-year school for technicians. So every morning I would go into the school and I would face about 25 other young men the same age as myself to teach them basic electrical theory. Imagine that standing in front of these other 25 people and giving a talk for a couple hours every morning, I became pretty good at public speaking. I was still an introvert, but I found that I could do what I had to do. And the ability to speak in public was very useful for the rest of my career. After that first year, things started getting better in the economy, and General Dynamics in Rochester had quite a big operation with probably a couple thousand engineers. I applied for a job there. And of course, when I showed up for the interview, they showed me a picture of a transistor and asked what kind it was. I had no clue, but I guessed, got it right, and they hired me. Actually, very few people at that point knew anything about transistors. My first task was fixing a very complex digital transistor system. It was a big cabinet, 4 vertical drawers. When you pulled the drawer out, there were row after row of 3-inch square printed circuit boards full of transistors and other components. Somehow, when they wired the system up, there'd be 1 or 2 wires connected to the wrong place on each printed circuit board. It took me several months to try to get it straightened out. I'm sure that my boss knew even less about transistors than I did. So when I showed up, he said, okay, here's the system. It's not working right. Here's the logic diagrams. Here's a technician to help you change the solders if you have to solder some new wires. And here's an oscilloscope. Go to work. It took me several months, but I finally got it all working the way it was supposed to. Then I became Mr. Fix-It. I guess doing that project made people believe that I could fix anything. So for the next 3 years, I kept being assigned to different projects where they were having problems. I would go in and help fix the problem. Finally got pretty annoyed at that and decided I really wanted my own project. So they sent me down to Cape Canaveral, and I got the specifications for a system that would allow people to push buttons on the control panels at Cape Canaveral and send commands down to the islands in the Caribbean that the rockets flew over on their way, so that they could control the equipment down there from Cape Canaveral. So I got the specification, I wrote the proposal, I estimated the cost, which was about $1 million, and got the project. So I was the key designer on it. I had one other person that helped design the modem to transmit data underwater in the underwater cables, but I did all the digital design. We got it done and installed down there. It worked fine and was there in time for the first moon launch. I also got my first patent on how you pushed a button and generated the digital message to go down the range. the time I got done, General Dynamics in Rochester was not doing very well. They had nothing going on that I was interested in, so I started looking for a new job. That would be in 1968. My next job was with a startup company, Rochester Instrument Systems. They had designed something that would monitor what was going on in power plants and power substations. One of the founders of the company and one of their other engineers who really wanted to be a salesman had designed their first system, and they'd shipped a few of them, but they didn't quite work properly. So they hired me, and I went in and straightened it out and got everything working. So in those early years, I would go out and help sell the products. I designed them, I tested them, I checked them out in the factory. When they were installed, I'd go and turn them on and check them out at the power plant. And if any of them broke, I'd go out and fix them. The company grew rapidly. When I joined, the sales the previous year had been $180,000. I worked there for 20 years. And when the time I left, our sales in a year were over $40 million. In addition to designing things, I also did a lot of travel. I counted one time I'd been to 46 of the 48 states in the US. I took 4 trips to China when China first started opening up to the outside world. We bought a company in England, and my job was to go over to England every couple of months and spend a week making sure they were doing what they were supposed to do. So actually, most of the time I spent traveling around England and helping with the sales. Also made trips to a number of places in Europe and even to Saudi Arabia. I became the vice president of engineering while my children were all in college, which really helped with the college payments. But shortly after that, the company changed hands. The 2 founders never did get along, and they were getting into big fights. They finally sold out the company to another bigger company. 6 months later, that bigger company got sold out to an even bigger company. And they were starting to make changes in our organization, which I wasn't happy about. So I quit. And I took a job with another startup company, but that didn't work out very well. So then I decided I'd be a contract engineer. I just took jobs wherever people needed some extra help. I had a lot of experience and knew about a lot of different things. I'd go and work for some place that had a problem for maybe a couple of weeks or a month. And I did okay for a while that way. But finally, one of the companies I worked for asked me to come and work full time. Another startup, very small company, they had a patent on a way to make a TV screen, a standard computer screen, show 3-dimensional images. It was the most complex design I ever did. The idea was to take 2 cameras, having them sit side by side, and having the data from both cameras show up on the screen, and then the lighting behind the screen would direct the left eye image into your left eye and the right eye image into your right eye, and you'd see a 3-dimensional image on the screen. It was very impressive, but I didn't see that they had much of a market for it. I was in my late 50s by then. I wanted to work until I was 65, so I found another job. With a company called Qualitrol. They were in Fairport. They made mechanical temperature monitors for big power. One of them would show the oil temperature of the oil that was keeping the transformer cool, and the other one would have a way of calculating the temperature of the wire on the transformers. You couldn't have anything touching the transformer wires because they were up in several 100,000 volts. But they were concerned that in the more modern world now, they didn't want to just have people being able to go out and look at the transformer and see what the temperature was. They wanted to be able to transmit the temperatures down to their home office. So even though the place was mostly just mechanical equipment, I designed their first electronic product for them. And the first one was just for lower voltage transformers. And finally, one of my jobs was to travel around the country, visit lots of power companies, and find out what they would like to have in a product that would actually monitor the very high voltage transformer. I wrote the specifications for that. Then I was 65, so I quit. Somebody else actually designed the product. But when I said I was quitting, they said, "Oh, no, you can't quit." I said, "Yes, I can. I'm 65 years old." They said, "Well, if we have trouble, we can call you, right?" So actually, for the next 3 or 4 years, I'd get 2 or 3 calls every year asking me to come in and help solve some problem. And then I did actually retire. So my family, I had 3 children, and each of them have 2 grandchildren. One son went into the Army ROTC program, eventually joined the 82nd Airborne, was in a lot of our military activities. Eventually got out, became a financial advisor, and then formed his own company. My other son was an entrepreneur. He started business when he was in 9th grade. And he started many businesses after that and eventually became quite successful. He still lives in Rochester. My daughter became one of the first women electrical power engineers. She still designs power substations. My first wife and I separated when the children were in high school. The children stayed with me. After they were out of college, I met my present wife, Sandy. Now, when I was in school, my fraternity big brother kept asking me to go to church with him on Sunday. Finally, I gave up and I went to church, and the topic was, what does it mean to be a Unitarian? I immediately knew that I was a Unitarian. The first visit, actually, to a Unitarian church in Rochester was the very last day that the downtown Unitarian church was open. We went in and wondered why everybody looked so sad. Some people actually were crying. It was the last day that church was open. But the church closed because it was, I think, where Midtown parking garage is. The city bought it out. And then we didn't go again until the present day church opened up. So we joined the church. Our children were quite small then. I helped a lot out in the Sunday school program. Dick Gilbert was minister. He asked me to be the head usher. And he was very fussy about the doors being closed the instant the church started. They could only be open for latecomers during the meet and greet period. He also insisted that I wear a jacket and tie, which was something I never really liked to do, but I did it. Evening programs in those days were very popular. There was only a couple of TV channels. You know, there was no computers, there was no internet, there were no cell phones. So the start of every fall season, we'd look forward to seeing what programs were going to be at the church in the evenings during the weekdays. And one of the programs I went to was how to run a meeting. It was taught by a retired person from Kodak. And after I took that course, Dick Gilbert asked me to run the introduction to UU. I did this a couple times a year for several years. This was during the time when the church was becoming very popular. We would have meetings in the Susan B. Anthony Lounge. There might be 25 or 30 people sitting there in chairs. And for the first 3 meetings, I would run the meeting. Then Dick Gilbert, the minister, would come to the 4th meeting, and the head of the Sunday school would come to the 5th meeting. I did this for several years. We did it a couple times a year. This was when the church was growing very rapidly. So I was on the Buildings and Grounds Committee the first time the roof leaked. And at that time, they found out that when the bricks would get damp and then it would freeze, the pieces of bricks were popping off the building. So it was sort of a difficult time to be on Buildings and Grounds. I was on the church board in the early 1970s. And during the 1970s, we did a Gilbert and Sullivan operetta every year. It would run for 3 nights. We'd have a full house every night and made a lot of money for the church. I used to sing in the chorus, and that's where I met my present wife, Sandy, when she came to sing with us as well. So I joined the UU School Partnership in the early 90s, became treasurer, and after I retired from work, I've been volunteering at School 22 ever since. I gave up the treasurer a few years ago, and for many years, we've been selling bagels the first of each month to raise money for the school partnership. My wife's been very active in a number of committees and ran the annual rummage sale for the past 10 years. In the recent year, I was asked to help with the intro to UU, which is done after the church service, when the assistant minister, the one before Reverend Bob, needed help doing it. Adirondacks, our church summer camp in the Adirondacks, has been very important to me for many years. We started going to family camp with my children when they were quite young. I joined the board when the main lodge burned down. At that time, Susan McNamara was president of the board. We raised money and helped with the design for the new lodge. I became a president of the board after that, and both my sons worked at the camp during their time in college. In recent years, my son, who was the entrepreneur, became president of the board and was very instrumental in upgrading camp and building new buildings. And I have another little picture here. This was the last time I was at camp. I was 80 years old. The last project my son had was to build the boathouse. There'd been a boathouse back a long, long time ago, but it had taken down. He built the boathouse. All the buildings at the camp are named after people. So he got the boathouse named the Hollands Boathouse. Livy, how are we doing for time? Do I have a few more minutes? Okay, carrying on. Other activities that I've been involved with. During the 70s, I got interested in sailing. And for several years, I crewed on racing boats at the Rochester Yacht Club. Eventually joined the yacht club and bought a sailboat, 33-foot sailboat, and raced it 2 or 3 times a week for 20 years. And I just happen to have one more picture. This was my boat. This was taken from an airplane during some big regatta when we were sailing across the lake. When I retired from work, I stopped racing and sold my boat. Then I quit the yacht club, but then they came back and said, we're looking for sailing instructors. So I taught sailing at Rochester Yacht Club for 8 years. During the time we were doing the racing, computers came out. You know, I got my first home computer, and then you wonder what you're going to do with it. Well, I was helping with the scoring at the yacht club, which was quite a bit of arithmetic and things to do. So I wrote a computer program. Had to teach myself how to write computer programs. I'd never really programmed a computer before. And wrote a computer program to do the scoring. Eventually I kept improving it, and finally I thought, gee, this is a good program. Maybe other people could use it. So we started marketing the computer program to other yacht clubs. And I sold several hundred copies, made a fair amount of money. We used to use that extra money to make travel trips. And then I guess my name got out because I was selling the primary program for scoring yacht club races. We'd get invited to score big regattas around the country. So every summer we'd travel different places in the US to score big sailboat regattas. When my grandson was in 6th grade, he wanted to join the high school robot team. The principal said that he could do that, but they didn't have a coach for the robot teams. So I got invited to be the robot team coach. I coached the robot team at the Harley School for 8 years. Had a good time doing it. Back in the 1990s, I became a member of the board of the Funeral Consumers Alliance of Greater Rochester. The Funeral Consumers Alliance actually started out in our church as the Memorial Society, where they were recommending services separate from body dispositions. Back in the 60s, this was happening around the country. They all got together, formed a Funeral Consumers Alliance to encourage other aspects of funeral planning. And the church, our church still is the mailing address for the Funeral Consumers Alliance of Greater Rochester. And I served on the board for many years as the treasurer and as the speaker, talking to various groups about funeral planning and how to avoid problems and spending a lot of money. And that's the end of my presentation.
Where we live now? Talk about where we live now.
My wife says I should tell you where we live now. We're living in the Baywin Senior development for people who are still able to get around, but we're living in an environment with some assistance.
Separate.
Hmm?
Separate buildings.
Yeah, Sandy's just telling me, well, the main building here has 120 apartments for people who can get around pretty much on their own. And then we have 14 villas, which are small houses, and we live in one of the villas. And we've been pretty much locked down the last couple months. That's it.
Well, thank you, Dan.